It doesn't just burn, it melts through skin, through muscle, through bone, and when surgeons try to remove it, it reignites. Inside the operating room, the shells have been identified, the village has been named, and the country responsible is one of America's closest allies. But here's what nobody is telling you. This wasn't an accident. Welcome to Currency Archive. Now, before we go any further, if you've stumbled onto this channel for the first time, do something your grandfather never did before reading the full newspaper. Subscribe first. Ask questions later. Hit that button. You won't regret it. And tell us, where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop your city, your country, anything, because what we're about to show you affects every single one of you, no matter where you are. On a quiet afternoon in the village of Yohmor in southern Lebanon, something fell from the sky. It was not a conventional bomb. It did not arrive with a single explosion. Instead, it burst open mid-air, and what followed was something far more terrifying than a simple blast. Streaks of white fire began raining down across rooftops, gardens, and streets. Within seconds, thick white smoke blanketed the entire area. Residents who were caught outside began screaming, not because of shrapnel, not because of debris, but because whatever had touched their skin would not stop burning. International human rights observers were on the ground within hours. What they found was not ambiguous. The evidence was clear, documented, and deeply alarming. Investigators confirmed the use of airburst white phosphorus munitions, artillery shells specifically designed to open at high altitude and scatter burning chemical particles across a wide area below. The shells were not unknown. They were identified as M825-series 155mm artillery rounds, a munition well documented in military records, and one with a very specific country of origin. But before the question of origin is addressed, it is important to understand exactly what this weapon does, because without that understanding, the full weight of what happened in Yohmor cannot be appreciated. White phosphorus is not a conventional explosive. It is a chemical substance that ignites the moment it comes into contact with oxygen. There is no countdown. There is no delay. The moment it is exposed to open air, it begins burning, and it does not stop until every last particle has been completely consumed or until it is entirely sealed away from oxygen. It burns at temperatures exceeding 800 degrees Celsius. To put that into perspective, that is hot enough to melt aluminium, hot enough to burn through standard protective clothing in seconds, hot enough to reach muscle and bone before a victim even fully registers the pain. Medical specialists who have treated white phosphorus burns describe them as among the most complex and dangerous injuries in modern warfare. The burns are both chemical and thermal simultaneously, meaning they do not behave like ordinary fire wounds. They go deeper, they spread further, and they do not simply stop when the visible flame is extinguished. Fragments of white phosphorus can embed themselves beneath the skin and remain dormant, only to reignite when exposed to oxygen again. This creates a situation that is almost unimaginable in a surgical setting. Doctors attempting to remove phosphorus fragments from a patient's body must work under controlled conditions, keeping the wound moist at all times. If the wound dries even slightly during the procedure, the fragment can reignite inside the operating room, inside the patient's body, while the surgeon's hands are still present. In some cases, victims who appeared to have only minor surface wounds were later found to be experiencing organ failure because the chemical had already penetrated deep enough to affect internal systems before the external burn was even fully visible. The evidence recovered from Yohmor was extensive. High-resolution images taken by investigators clearly showed the remains of M825-series 155mm artillery shells scattered across the site. The M825 is not an obscure or experimental weapon. It is a well-documented munition used by a small number of militaries globally. Its design, its markings, and its delivery mechanism are all on record. Investigators did not need to speculate about what had been used. The shells identified themselves. What international law says about this is equally clear, at least in principle. White phosphorus is not banned outright under international law. This is a fact that certain governments have used repeatedly to deflect criticism. Technically, they argue, it is not illegal. But its deployment over densely populated civilian areas is widely regarded as a violation of international humanitarian law. Specifically, it falls under the prohibition against indiscriminate weapons, munitions that cannot distinguish between military targets and civilian populations. Yohmor is not a military base. It is not a weapons depot. It is a village. People live there. Families live there. And on that afternoon, white fire rained down on all of them equally. There is a particular kind of silence that follows a chemical attack. It is not the silence of peace. It is not the silence of resolution. It is the silence of a population that has been broken so completely, so suddenly, that it no longer knows where to go, who to call, or whether help is even coming. That is the silence that settled over southern Lebanon in the hours after Yohmor. And in the business of war, that silence has a price tag. Within hours of the attack, the roads leading out of southern Lebanon were overwhelmed. Families carried whatever they could. Elderly residents who had lived in the same village for decades were being loaded into cars and trucks by neighbors who barely had enough room for their own children. Livestock were abandoned. Businesses were locked and left. Entire communities that had taken generations to build were emptied in a single afternoon. The displacement did not happen gradually. It happened all at once. Reports confirmed that hundreds of thousands of residents were forced to flee the border region in a matter of days. This was not a slow migration. This was a mass evacuation driven purely by fear. The fear of a weapon that burns through walls, through clothing, through skin, and cannot be stopped by running water or basic medical treatment. When populations move this fast, economies do not simply pause, they collapse. Every displaced family represents a broken economic unit. Small business owners who had spent years building local trade networks were suddenly gone. Agricultural land that supplied surrounding towns with produce was abandoned mid-harvest. Supply chains that had functioned quietly and reliably for years were severed overnight. Southern Lebanon is not an isolated backwater. It sits along critical trade and transit corridors that connect Lebanon's interior to its coastal cities and onward to regional markets. When this corridor is disrupted, not by a brief military engagement, but by a sustained chemical threat that makes entire areas uninhabitable, the economic damage does not stay local. It spreads. Suppliers in Beirut suddenly found themselves without deliveries. Distributors who depended on southern agricultural output began scrambling for alternatives. Transportation companies rerouted at significant additional cost. And all of this happened simultaneously, without warning and without any clear timeline for resolution. The hospitals tell a story of their own. Medical facilities closest to the affected areas were the first to feel the impact. They were not designed or equipped to handle mass casualties involving chemical burns. White phosphorus injuries require specialized treatment protocols. Constant wound irrigation, controlled surgical environments, specific chemical neutralization procedures, none of which are standard equipment in regional Lebanese hospitals already operating under severe resource constraints. Doctors and nurses were doing their best with what they had, but what they had was not enough. Patients with phosphorus burns were arriving faster than they could be processed. Surgical teams were working without adequate protective equipment. Supply inventories, already thin due to Lebanon's ongoing economic crisis, were being depleted at rates that no procurement system had anticipated. And the wounds themselves were unlike anything most of the medical staff had encountered before. Burns that appeared manageable on the surface were quietly destroying tissue at deeper levels. Patients who had been stabilized were later found to be deteriorating internally. The chemical did not announce its full damage immediately. It revealed it slowly, over hours, sometimes over days, by which point intervention had become significantly more complicated. Medical professionals working in the region began issuing quiet warnings to international health organizations. They were not asking for sympathy. They were asking for supplies, for specialist support, and for a clear answer to a question that nobody in the international community seemed willing to address directly. How long is this going to continue? That question had no answer. Because the displacement was not slowing down, the attacks were not stopping, and the resources needed to manage the crisis were not arriving at the speed the crisis was moving. Humanitarian emergencies of this scale follow a predictable pattern, one that economists and conflict analysts have documented across decades of modern warfare. The longer a civilian population remains displaced, the harder it becomes to rebuild. Infrastructure decays, supply networks dissolve permanently rather than temporarily, skilled workers relocate and do not return, investment flees and does not come back easily. What begins as a military engagement becomes, over time, an economic wound that outlasts the conflict itself by years, sometimes by decades. Southern Lebanon has been here before, but not quite like this. There is a reason powerful nations write the rules of war. It is not because they intend to follow them, it is because they intend to control what happens when someone else breaks them. And right now, in the corridors of international law, a very uncomfortable conversation is taking place, one that involves not just the country that fired these shells, but the country that manufactured them. Let us be precise about what international law actually says. White phosphorus is not listed as a prohibited weapon under the Chemical Weapons Convention. This is a fact that certain governments have used repeatedly to deflect criticism. Technically, they argue, it is not illegal. But international humanitarian law does not operate on technicalities alone. The legal framework governing the conduct of war, specifically the Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols, prohibits the use of any weapon in a manner that is indiscriminate, meaning any weapon that cannot distinguish between a military target and a civilian population is prohibited, regardless of what that weapon is chemically classified as. White phosphorus, when deployed as an airburst munition over a residential village, does not distinguish. It does not check whether the person standing below is a soldier or a grandmother. It does not pause before landing on a school or a hospital. It burns everything it touches with equal, devastating efficiency. That is the legal argument that human rights organizations are now placing on the table. And it is an argument that has significant historical and judicial precedent behind it. The shells recovered from Yohmor have made this conversation significantly more complicated for one particular nation. The M825-series 155mm artillery round is an American-manufactured munition. It is produced under U.S. defense contracts and exported to a limited number of Allied militaries under strict, at least theoretically strict, end-use agreements. Those agreements are not ceremonial. Under U.S. law, specifically the Foreign Assistance Act and the Arms Export Control Act, weapons supplied by the United States to foreign governments cannot be used in ways that violate international humanitarian law. If they are, the supply of those weapons is supposed to stop. This is not a minor legal footnote. This is a binding statutory obligation. When investigators confirmed the presence of M825 shells in Yohmor, in a civilian area deployed in a manner consistent with indiscriminate use, they did not just implicate the military that fired them. They implicated the government that supplied them. Washington now faces a question it has historically been very skilled at avoiding. What happens when the evidence makes avoidance impossible? Human rights organizations are not waiting for that question to be answered voluntarily. Groups including Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have formally documented the Yohmor incident and are demanding independent international investigations. Their reports are not opinion pieces. They are legal submissions, carefully constructed documents designed to withstand scrutiny in international judicial forums. The calls being made are specific. They are not asking for statements of concern. They are asking for 3 concrete actions. First, an independent investigation with unrestricted access to the affected areas, conducted by parties with no political relationship to either side of the conflict. Second, the suspension of military assistance to any party found to have used white phosphorus in civilian areas, pending the outcome of that investigation. Third, the referral of evidence to the International Criminal Court for assessment of potential war crimes, charges against responsible commanders and decision-makers. These are not symbolic demands. Each one carries real legal and political weight, and each one places a different set of governments in a deeply uncomfortable position. Because here is where geopolitics becomes economics. Sanctions are not abstract. When human rights bodies successfully build enough international pressure to trigger sanctions proceedings, markets respond. Defense contracts are reviewed. Export licenses are suspended. Allied governments begin quietly reassessing their public association with the sanctioned party. Israel's economy, modern, technology-driven, deeply integrated into global financial systems, is not immune to this kind of pressure. Quite the opposite. Its exposure to international capital markets, its dependence on technology export revenues, and its deep integration with Western financial institutions make it particularly sensitive to sustained reputational and legal pressure. And the pressure is building, not loudly, not yet dramatically, but in the deliberate, methodical way that international legal processes move, which is often slow but rarely stops once it has begun. Western alliance narratives are fracturing quietly around this incident in ways that diplomatic language is struggling to conceal. Several European governments that have historically maintained strong public support for Israel are now facing domestic political pressure to respond to the Yohmor evidence. Parliamentary questions are being raised. Coalition partners are demanding answers. Foreign ministers are being called to justify positions that were far easier to hold before high-resolution images of M825 shells in a Lebanese village became publicly available. The alliance is not breaking, but it is bending. And in geopolitics, as in economics, the moment a structure begins to bend under pressure is precisely the moment serious analysts start asking how much more weight it can hold. History does not announce itself. It does not send a warning. It does not pause to allow preparation. It simply arrives. And by the time most people recognize what is happening, the window for strategic positioning has already closed. What is unfolding in southern Lebanon right now is not simply a regional military conflict. It is not simply a humanitarian crisis. And it is certainly not simply a legal dispute between human rights organizations and governments that would prefer to look the other way. It is an economic signal. And for the business community, ignoring economic signals has always been far more costly than acting on them early. Begin with geography, because geography is where economics always begins. Lebanon sits at one of the most strategically sensitive intersections in the entire Mediterranean basin. It shares borders with Syria to the north and east, and Israel to the south. Its western coastline opens directly onto Mediterranean shipping lanes that connect European markets to Middle Eastern energy producers and onward to Asian supply chains. Beirut, despite its years of economic crisis, remains a financial node. Its banking sector, battered but not destroyed, still processes significant volumes of regional capital flows. Its port, despite the catastrophic 2020 explosion, remains a critical entry point for goods moving into the Levant interior. When southern Lebanon becomes a conflict zone of this intensity, not a brief skirmish, but A sustained engagement involving chemical weapons, mass displacement, and international legal proceedings, it does not just affect the villages being struck. It affects the entire corridor. Energy markets are the first place serious analysts look when Middle Eastern conflicts escalate beyond containment. Lebanon itself is not a major energy producer, but its geographic position places it directly adjacent to some of the most contested offshore energy territory in the eastern Mediterranean. Israeli offshore gas fields, including Leviathan and Karish, sit within a relatively short distance of Lebanese territorial waters, in a region where maritime boundary disputes have never been fully resolved. An escalating conflict on Lebanese soil, particularly one that is drawing international legal scrutiny and threatening to trigger sanctions proceedings, introduces a category of risk that energy markets price very quickly: uncertainty. Sustained, unresolvable, legally complex uncertainty. When Brent crude traders begin pricing in eastern Mediterranean instability, the effects are not contained to the region. They move through global energy supply chains with the quiet efficiency of a tide, raising costs for manufacturers, logistics companies, airlines, and ultimately consumers across Europe, Asia, and beyond. The business community does not need a war to feel the economic consequences of a conflict. It only needs the credible threat of escalation. That threshold has already been crossed. The sanctions dimension deserves particular attention from anyone operating in global trade. If international legal proceedings advance, and based on the evidence currently documented, there is a credible path toward that outcome, the resulting sanctions environment will not be surgical. It never is. Sanctions regimes, once activated, create ripple effects that extend far beyond their intended targets. Companies with supply chain exposure to sanctioned entities face compliance obligations that are expensive, time-consuming, and reputationally sensitive. Financial institutions that process transactions connected to sanctioned parties face regulatory penalties that can reach into the billions. For multinational corporations currently operating in the region or maintaining financial relationships with entities that do, the Yohmor incident is not background noise. It is a material risk factor that belongs in boardroom conversations and investor briefings. The question is not whether sanctions will affect business. The question is whether businesses are positioned early enough to adjust before the adjustment becomes forced. There's a broader precedent being set here that the global business community cannot afford to misread. When chemical weapons are used in civilian areas and the international response remains fragmented, delayed, and politically compromised, it does not just embolden the party that used them. It sends a signal to every other actor in every other conflict zone around the world. It signals that the rules can be broken, that the consequences can be managed, that economic integration with powerful allies provides sufficient insulation against accountability. That signal, if it holds, does not make the world more stable. It makes it measurably less stable. And instability in every form is the enemy of sustainable business growth, long-term investment, and the kind of predictable regulatory environment that commerce depends upon to function. The entrepreneurs and business professionals watching the situation unfold are not watching a foreign policy story. They are watching a stress test of the global rules-based order. And right now, that stress test does not have a clean result. The village of Yohmor will eventually be rebuilt, or it will not. The displaced families will eventually return, or they will not. The international legal proceedings will eventually reach a conclusion, or they will be quietly buried under the weight of geopolitical convenience. But the economic consequences of what happened there will not wait for any of those outcomes. They are already moving through markets, already being priced into risk assessments, already reshaping the quiet calculations that serious investors and business leaders make when they decide where to place capital, where to build supply chains, and which alliances are worth maintaining. The weapon used in Yohmor burns until it runs out of oxygen. The economic fire it has started operates on no such limitation. It will burn for as long as the world allows it to.